Welcome to Event Experience by Bizzabo, the podcast where we bring the best and brightest event experience leaders together to share stories, tips, and lessons learned from creating some of the world's biggest events. I'm Rachel Moore, your podcast host. Events are and always have been mostly about the who, what, when, and where. In this episode, we really get into the how and why with Margaret Richardson, Chief of Staff and Senior Director of External Relations at Devex. Together, we discuss the evolving landscape of events, the importance of storytelling in global development, and how brands can effectively manage their reputations through intentional experiences. There might also be a not-so-subtle Hamilton reference in this episode of Event Experience. Thanks, everyone, again for joining us on a new episode of Event Experience. I'm your host, Rachel Moore, and our guest today is the Chief of Staff and Senior Director of External Relations at Devex, where she leads strategic initiatives and high-impact partnerships that bridge business, journalism, and global development. She's passionate about using storytelling. We love storytelling here, and strategic partnerships to amplify stories that matter. Having spearheaded efforts that doubled Devex's team size and established meaningful media partnerships with organizations like the World Bank and MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. All of this and so much more that we're about to dig into is why I'm thrilled to welcome Margaret Richardson to the pod. Margaret, thanks for joining us here on Event Experience.
Sure. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And I always give a very brief intro of our guests. I don't do it justice, and I want to be able to hand it back over to you now. Can you tell me and our listeners a bit more about yourself, your world at Devex, and just what kind of goes on in your day-to-day?
Sure. So I work at an organization called Devex. We're a news organization for the international development community. And so like any news organization, we host a lot of events. We have journalists and editors all over the world who are reporting what's happening in this space. And then we host events to kind of bring our audience into that journalism, into that storytelling and experience. So I sit at this really interesting place between editorial partnerships and brand strategy, helping to shape the way that we as Devex show up in the world, from major global convenings like Davos and UNGA to some of the digital storytelling we do every day, to the smaller events, the ones that you'll never hear of and you might not or know are happening, but are as equally as important. So my real job is really to connect the dots between what's happening in global development and the audiences that need to hear it.
Excellent. Well, one thing I love that you said, which we're going to dig into, you said use the phrase show up in the world. So we're going to get into that, tease the audience here a little bit. First, I want to ask you some get to know you questions so our audience can get a little bit more sense of you. Obviously, we talk to a lot of event planners and event professionals here on the podcast. Something that seems to be a common theme are shoes. So I like to ask every guest, what are your go-to on-the-ground event day shoes, particularly for those really long days on the ground?
Definitely depends on the event. We do global events all over the world. So from like the mountains in the Alps, I have my boots all the way to, the hottest climates. But I think most events I'm wearing my Vivia shoes. I'm realizing I haven't said that out loud. Brand name out loud. Vivia shoes. They are a company, I believe, started by women who just wanted cute shoes that felt like sneakers. So they are the most comfortable shoes I can ever wear. They have boots, they have flats, they have actual sneakers. They have eco-friendly principles throughout their supply chain, so I feel good wearing them. I really believe that when you feel good about the story you're telling with your clothes, you're going to be a good storyteller yourself. So you can always find me in those.
Oh, those are great recs. And I especially we'll share it in the show notes, because you had me at they do boot all the kinds of shoes and they're comfortable and also cute. So definitely a keeper there. Thanks for that. Is there anything that you're watching, listening, or reading these days that you can't put down, and it doesn't have to be events related?
Yeah, I work for a news organization, so I read Devex every single morning. It's what I start my day with. We have our daily news wire, and then I'm always listening to our podcast, This Week in Global Development. It's a way for me to hear directly from our journalists about what they think has been important. Like, obviously, I try to read as much as I can, but I always listen to This Week in Global Development. And then I have a couple of other podcasts. I like the Ezra Klein show. I like How I Built This. Really important podcasts. And those are interesting because they give me infrastructure ways to think. They help me sort of place what's happening in the world in my brain. And then I'm a big reader. And right now I'm reading The Wager, which is an incredible story. It's about a shipwreck. It's by David Gann, I think. And it's a story about a shipwreck and a mutiny and two sides of a story. Basically, the story comes to a crux when the two groups of people show up and say, like, this is what happened. And then this is another side of what happened. And I think listening to fiction or reading fiction, listening to storytelling within fiction is a really important way to think through how to tell your tale and how to, it gives me inspiration for when I think about all of the other sort of real life stories we're trying to tell.
I love that. And you're so right. I'm a huge fan of fiction and I love that too. But yeah, that sounds like a good one to pick up. Again, we'll put that in the show notes. So that's a really great recommendation. Is there a particular social post or a piece of media or even a hot take about events that you found interesting lately?
Mhm. I think there's been a lot of conversation about the return to IRL, like the return to in real life events. But what I found particularly interesting recently is like just thinking about and people who have been talking about the future's not like hybrid or virtual or in person. It's really intention driven. When I think about events, I don't really think about them as an event planner. In fact, I would say like that's secondary for better or for worse. But I think about what do I want the audience to come away feeling? What do I want
Mhm.
them to know? What do I want them to go back and tell their families when their families are like, hey, like you were gone for a week. How was it? What is that like one piece of data that they're walking away from? I think like format's not really the point, the purpose is. Yeah. And that's pretty aligned with how my thinking around events have evolved generally.
That's super fascinating. This actually is a great springboard into kind of what we're going to cover with you today. And I already teased a little bit. You talk about how Devex and your team show up in the world. That's kind of what we're going to dig into right now. On this podcast, we talk a lot at length about how brands and teams can and should put on events. So, they're the great and powerful Oz behind the curtain, right? They're putting on the show. They're putting on events, executing activations, making the entire experience happen. But, you just again tease that up there. I'd love to talk about your ideas on other factors at play with how individuals and companies use events across the spectrum. So first things first, I know that you have some thoughts about reputation and how that feeds, how brands use events for that. What are your thoughts on how and why people and companies are intentionally using experiences to shift their own reputations?
Yeah, I think we're in a moment where reputation is shaped not by what you say about yourself, but what people experience of
Mm,
you. Like people are really smart and we've become really attuned to trying to parse out, is this real? Is this marketing? Like we're all online. Everybody's, scrolling on TikTok. They know if their influencer is
yeah.
really excited about a brand versus doing a brand deal. Like people are really smart about that. So I think events have become a form of strategic storytelling. They always should be, in my opinion, but I think increasingly when you're trying to get attention spans and you're trying to convince people to put their really valuable time like
Mhm.
on the line in your seats, it's become much more about how people are experiencing that storytelling. And when done well, an event can allow a brand or a leader to really inhabit a narrative, not just announce it. And I
Yeah.
think, whether you're trying to signal a reform or you're trying to showcase priorities or demonstrating social impact, convenings let you create living proof
Mm,
of your point. And they can be a reputational accelerator or they can act in the opposite way where people walk
right.
away feeling like, this may not be something I want to invest in again. So I think it's really important to think about how people are experiencing your brand, not just what they're hearing.
I really like that too. You're so right too about the feed. We all have whatever feed we're going to in the day. We're experiencing that. And gosh, we're all battling that whole like, is it real? Is it not? Is it authentic? Is it not?
Totally,
And
especially with AI. I think it's,
Mhm.
even more people are building this muscle whether they know it or not. And
Yeah.
so brands need to think about that when they're talking to their audiences and not to underestimate their intelligence on this point.
That's such a great point too. I love that too. And you really are giving people opportunity. And it's just like, it's like putting out a press release. You can say, okay, well, here's the talk about us thing. But then you get to the show part. Like, well, yes, but it's way different if you're seeing us in person or seeing our team in person and experiencing that in real time.
Totally.
Very, very different experience. We talked kind of about the state of the globe and all of us experiencing different things where we're coming from and what device we're picking up and what our experience is. It's safe to say that the globe is a bit tumultuous right now in many respects, which might lead one to think that people and brands are tending to avoid convening and participating in experiences. So I lodge that to you, but what are you seeing from your perspective? Is that the case? Are people avoiding it or are they flocking to it, do you think?
It's both and.
Mm.
When the world feels fragmented, convenings become essential. When people feel tumultuous, when people are anxious, they crave community. That's why during the pandemic, a lot of people craved time online. People were connecting in some ways more than ever with their family members online.
Mhm.
Families that never FaceTimed, all of a sudden now, we're FaceTiming and spending time on Zoom. When the world is fragmented, people crave convenings.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not those are public or private convenings, I think are the question, right? Yes, I've experienced some events where there are corporations or sort of big brand names that are showing up differently,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean they're not showing up, and that doesn't mean they're not showing up privately. There are increasingly many more private events that are happening, smaller dinners. And again, I think this speaks to the moment. Leaders are craving clarity and connection, and you only get that in person. Sure, you can call up a friend, you can do a lot of things online. Like, you can do that. When in journalism, you call your sources when you need clarity, right?
Right.
But you create those sources by meeting them in person so often. I mean, it's not impossible to do it,
Yeah.
digitally. But I think people are really trying to be in person, and they're showing up because they need to understand what's real, where things are going, and who they can rely on. And I just don't think you can replace in-person events like that.
Yeah.
Events aren't escapism, right? They're infrastructure for relationships. They're infrastructure for how you show up in the world. And they're a way for people and organizations to navigate volatility by grounding in community and intelligence and ultimately creating momentum towards what's next.
First of all, you took me back there a little bit because I do remember I had Zoom, and when COVID happened, we had family members in different states and might see each other at a random Thanksgiving, not even every Thanksgiving or something like that. But man, we just zoomed right over to Zoom and we're like, oh my God, let's get on and talk to each other. I just want to
Right.
see
We
people's
saw
faces.
people tuning into I have friends who never had gone to synagogue before, but they were tuning into their synagogue services because they
Yeah.
just were craving that connection and that community. I
Hmm.
think it's no accident that during a time of extreme isolation, we found ways to be together.
Yeah. Or even like taking walks and neighbors normally would just kind of be like, "Oh, I don't need to just." I was almost like intentionally like, "Please acknowledge, nod. Okay,
Yeah,
good. You're good. You're good. Great." And yeah, you're so
exactly.
and that was a time. I mean, gosh, we're all going to remember that as a huge time of tumult, but it's not the only one out there, obviously. And I love that you bring that up too, that it's an opportunity for not just individuals, but brands to seek out that in-person touch point that really can't be replaced by anything else. Yes, you and I are meeting digitally right now, as we're recording this podcast, but it's far different. Again, I'll go back, and if anyone can relate to this, I remember the first few times I was starting to like go out and be in person again with people after COVID, and I was like, I need to learn how to read people again, because
Totally.
right, because it's just like
And it
I'm
was
so used.
exhausting. People were really
Yes,
tired. A lot of folks were, but everybody was there. I mean, I remember
yeah,
talking about, like, is the UN General Assembly still going to happen? Is the World
right,
Economic Forum annual meeting still going to happen? Not only are they happening, they're bigger than ever. And that,
yeah,
my time doing this, and there are definitely people who've been doing it longer than I have, but in my over a decade of experience doing this, when things are anxiety producing and tumultuous, people show up. They
yeah,
just do. It looks
yeah.
different. It might feel different, but they do show up.
We'll be right back with more event experience after the break. Behind every great event organizer is software that makes managing the small stuff easy so you can focus on crafting events that matter. From seamless registration and on-site solutions like the Bizzabox to powerful dashboards and the Click Smart Badge, Bizzabo's Event Experience Operating System is your all-in-one solution to planning conferences that captivate and experiences that elevate. Visit bizzabo.com. That's bizzabo.com to learn more. We're back with Margaret Richardson for Real Talk about today's Room Where It Happens. Well, and that takes us to my next question, because not only do people show up, but then there's some place where outcomes might be determined because they did show up. And I'm going to bring in a Hamilton reference. You
Love
don't
it.
have Yep, you don't have to be a Hamilton fan, but to know the phrase, the room where it happens. And if you are a Hamilton fan now, you're going to probably go listen to the whole soundtrack after this episode. But in the business world, we can often think that a room is an actual conference room, or even as you just talked about Zoom rooms or a video call or a podcast recording or something like that. But what's your take on how people are using actual convenings, events, activations, experiences in real life to be their proverbial room where it happens? Like, how are they using that to catapult changes and outcomes and things like that?
Yeah, I think when the world feels fractured, when the industry feels unstable, when people aren't sure, they flock to convenings because of that, right? They
Mhm.
want to be there. They want to hear what people are saying. They want to understand what brands and companies are saying about the moment, what they can take back, how that fits into their worldview. I think people increasingly understand that the room where it happens is really actually the official agenda. It's the edges, right? It's the
Yeah.
curated dinners, it's the hallway conversations, it's the side meetings, it's the moment where the right mix of people come together.
Mhm.
And so when I think about being in the room where it happens, my editorial brain thinks about convenings as layered storytelling. So, what is
Yeah.
the story you're telling on the main stage? What's the narrative of the event? What's the backstage narrative? And then what is the sort of network narrative that you're telling? And I think that people who do great convenings think about all three. They think about as I said earlier, the entire experience. They're intentional about who they're sitting next to who at which dinner, who they're elevating, stories that they're reinforcing through presence and different details. I think rooms and events that create real momentum and alignment and opportunity crystallize when you are really thoughtful about all of the details. And that includes like who you're inviting, who are you targeting, what people, what voices are you trying to make sure are really represented. And
Yeah.
it's that kind of perfect chemistry that makes people feel like, oh yeah, I've got to be there because that's where the agenda is set for the year ahead. That's where we're going to hear about the future of this specific global health initiative. That's where we're going to find out about what are the different factions of
Mhm.
climate resilience. And I think a thoughtful event thinks about that in that chemistry.
You said something there too. This kind of brought me back to, I love that book recommendation you shared earlier as well, but the different storylines. Because I think it can be super easy for an event planner, and maybe not even just thinking of small events, it can happen at large events as well, where you're like, well, there is only one storyline. There's just one.
Of
There's
course.
one pathway that all attendees are going to take, and they're all going to be part of that one same storyline. That's not the case, though. I like that you brought that up because it's like, yeah, there might be, okay, the keynote stage. Sure. And, there's people that they're following storyline there. But then, like you just said, well, maybe it's like, what about lunchtime? And people, maybe they leave or they go and then they're sitting at tables
Exactly.
together. That can be a different storyline within the same arc of the narrative that the whole event. And that really, man, I love that analogy, or that how you painted that picture, because it gives you so much space as an event planner to say, there are different paths and different aspects to this event that are all still very real, but they're gonna be a different experience, but they're all part of the whole,
No,
right?
that's exactly it. And I think you've got to think like an editor, even if you're not part of a news organization. Like, look, I get it. When brands show up, they have to be very careful about what is said. They have to think through, like, how are we marketing ourselves? There's a lot of things to consider, especially if you're a major corporation. You've got legal to work with. I really understand that. But people want to hear both sides of the story. They want to come away buzzing with perspective. And that's going to take maybe somebody disagreeing with you, or elevating a voice that's different for you and your brand, just like an editor would. You never write a story without going through due process of making sure that, if you're doing an investigation, everybody gets to say, everybody gets to sort of the right of return, the right of the ability to tell you what
Yeah.
their side of the story is. And I think brands should think about stories holistically, not just as telling their own story, but where does their story sit within the entire landscape?
Mhm. Such a great point, and that also takes me to this. So, I mean, I really just love too the thinking like an editor, which again, event planners, you're listening to this and watching this. I mean, we know you're accomplishing the Herculean, feats and tasks and trying to make these events happen, but really kind of framing that again, how you're approaching this with how you're thinking about the event as a whole and how the attendee will experience it, and then how you craft it then for those outcomes. But to think like an editor, like you said, and let each of those narratives and each of those storylines have their moment. And like you said, not be scared of it, which so this tees up this next question. You just mentioned like all the things that an organization or business are thinking about. They're naturally thinking and considering and weighing risks and things like that when they are showing up in the world at events. What is something particular that you think they should be thinking about and mindful of as they choose, as organizations and businesses choose how and where they are showing up to convenings?
I think you need to think about where your audience is showing up.
Mm,
Often, where brands want to show up, they're reaching a very particular set of audience members. Maybe it's where they're most comfortable, maybe it's where they think they should be. There are so many convenings happening, and our audiences are growing. Where is Gen Z showing up? Where are they listening? Like, are they going to the same events that you've been going to for 20 years? If so, great. If not, maybe it's time to explore another event, and you don't have to go gangbusters the first event, but you should really be
right.
thinking about, like, how is your audience changing? What are they paying attention to? What are they nervous about? Where are they showing up? And then I think you have to think about the story you're trying to tell. Is this a year that you are trying to project real leadership in a space? And if so, how are you doing that across every single event that you're doing? And I think, don't forget the online components of events, right? Like, how are you showing, discipline in that storytelling across all the platforms? Because a lot of your audience isn't going to be able to necessarily show up in person. And you
Right.
want to make sure that event is reaching those people who, can't afford to fly to New York, or, who are not going to be able to be there. How are they experiencing your event?
Yeah. Really, those are some great considerations too. And yeah, audience being the whole thing too. But I like that you're giving us so many different ways that an event planner can just like, it can be very easy to be myopic, especially get in a set it, forget it kind of frame of mind where it's like, well, we just do this all the time, or this is the way we do it all the time. And not that that's a bad thing. You might have a great process for like looking at data, determining what your next move is going to be, crafting the event, or the experience as you take all that in. But there's nothing wrong and everything right with just looking at that in it from a different lens. And again, love the editorial perspective of it, where you are looking at it from just kind of freeing up those different storylines and the experiences and letting that audience experience all that, and all of that driving back to what you said already about, okay, now they've got a real sense of who we are as a brand, that we can let them be
Absolutely.
who they are.
Look, event planners are like the most amazing people on the
Yeah.
planet. They work so hard. They balance everything. They're keeping everybody's different perspectives and opinions and needs in mind. Like, I admire the hell out of event planners. And they're also the people with the most access to the
Mm,
information, right? Like, there's nobody like an event planner when it comes to understanding the brand, the marketing, the stories they want to tell, the speakers. Like, you have access to everything. And so I think I work with some incredible event planners, and they have all taught me to take that step back and look at what is the big picture, and like to constantly do that. Like, we're constantly in the details and keeping the big picture in mind. And I think my journalists also do that, right? When you're writing a story, it's so easy to get into the weeds, especially on a topic like international development. It's so easy to get super in the weeds on a very specific, detail, but you
yeah.
always have to come back out and tell the actual story and the big picture of what you're trying to do, and where does the story fall and everything else that's happening. I just think event planners have the best access to this information, and they should be trusted by the other folks around them to be advising on, look, like, you're trying to tell this story, here's how we do it, based
Hmm.
on your years of experience doing this and what you know to be true about the rest of the program.
I'm sure they're all the event planners listening are like, yes, sister, amen. They're like, you're just really applauding that sentiment and possibly forwarding this episode on to their managers and be like, see, this is such great insight and advice. And I do want to pivot to something I always ask every guest on the show. And this can be a little bit of a tricky, or a little bit of a large ask, because obviously you've got a lot. I think you've been with Devex. Is it over 11 years? I wanted to say I saw. Yeah. So, which time flies when you're doing a great work and having fun.
I'm at that point where I tell people how long I've been at Devex, and they're like, wow, there's like a big reaction. I'm
Whoa.
like, yeah, it doesn't feel like it. It just doesn't. But I think it speaks to how interesting the industry is, and how interesting
Yeah.
it is to work for an organization that does think in
Yeah.
this way and does prioritize the storytelling and the different events. So, but
Yeah.
yeah, it gets a big reaction these days.
Excellent. Well, I only have one last question for you. It's probably the easiest question of all. Where can our listeners find and follow you online?
Oh, fun. I'm probably the most active on LinkedIn, and even then, it should be a New Year's resolution to get better at that. But yeah, LinkedIn is probably the best way to find me.
Excellent. Well, we'll look for you there and we'll have that link in the show notes. You don't have to be a journalist to tap into Margaret's skill up advice for event planners.
I think it's think like an editor. Think like an editor and shorten your panels. Shorten your panels.
Yes.
Shorten everything. Everything that you have, cut it in half. Like we do 7-minute segments. We do 15-minute panels. And have the confidence to tell your speakers that no, in fact, you can do this. Like this is actually right. We get more compliments on the length of our 15-minute panels ever. That's the biggest compliment we get, is that it shorts out. People are watching TV, right? People are used to 5-minute reels and quick hits on TV. Gone are the days of 30-minute panels. And frankly, the panel format in general, I would say shake it up. I did a great event with a fantastic partner of mine where we did hot takes instead of a panel. We just pulled people up and we did really quick hot takes. And then we had hot or not at the end, where people said I just said a word and they said hot or not. And it was great and it was super engaging. But I think it goes back to thinking like an editor, where you're actually thinking about the audience experience. You're thinking about, where's the tension? Where's the resolution? Who's the protagonist of this story? What are you actually trying to get across? And when you think about it from the audience's perspective, nobody could advise sitting through 4 hours of just back-to-back panels. If you're thinking about the audience, you're thinking, okay, what is that? What's interesting to them? So I think thinking like an editor and shortening everything.
Well, that makes so much sense, because you're right. We just talked about feeds and what people are seeing. It's brevity is the soul of wit, and literally everything people are seeing and ingesting these days. But what great advice. And then, again, thinking like an editor, that all drives back to that, where it's think like that. Think of what the audience is responding to and what they're used to engaging with, and deliver that, and love all that. Is there any question you feel like you would like me to ask that I didn't ask or get to, that you wanted? You're like, oh my gosh, it's burning in my brain. I just want to make sure I put this out there.
No, I just think, just in the topic of questions, I think asking yourself a question when you're planning an event about what does success look like at the end of the day, and thinking about it not as how many people are in the room, but thinking about the quality of people in the room, not how many panels we did, but what conversations we actually sparked, not how many impressions we got on social media, but what is that data point that now everybody is saying for the rest of the year, and how do you get to that point? I think you just made me think about, questions to be asking ourselves as people who think about events. And that's one of them that I really like to think about, is what does the actual success look like?
It's a great point, because the vanity metrics are great, but at the end of the day, what's going to move the needle for you, right? And that's super important to think about.
Right.
Thanks again to Margaret Richardson for joining us on Event Experience, and thank you for listening. If you're enjoying the show, we'd love to hear it. Connect with us on social and subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you're listening. Also, don't forget to share the show with your colleagues and friends. You can find transcripts of each episode and key takeaways on bizzabo.com/podcast. On behalf of the team, thank you. We'll gather again soon for a new episode of Event Experience.